Now we've got history professor at Boston College and the author of the best-selling book Democracy Awakening and the massively successful Letters from an American Newsletter, Heather Cox Richardson. Heather, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to work with you.
So I want to dive in here and give some historical context to the moment that we're in right now. Donald Trump's plan, if he wins the election, is to consolidate power into the executive branch. In my opinion, the most chilling part of Project 2025, for example, is the reclassification of career civil servants in our government's workforce into political appointees. And that would effectively turn the entire government, the IRS, the FBI, the DOJ, the FCC, into a tool of Trump's political interests. So this may all feel new for us, but I'm curious as to whether there's precedent in history where, for example, leaders engaged in similar tactics and what happened to that system of government in those instances. So, for example, did those countries then descend into autocracy?
Well, there are comparisons in other countries for sure. Project 2025, which is the project that's been embraced by the the Trump-Vance campaign, deliberately builds on what Viktor Orban has done in Hungary, where he took a democracy and he overturned it by concentrating power in his own hands. Now, one of the things about Project 2025 is that it talks about civil servants and turning them into loyalists for Trump. It also talks about taking over the Department of Justice and ceasing to honor the rule of law and instead having people in the Department of Justice who do what Trump wants them to. It also talks about the military. So the idea is to concentrate all of those positions of power in our society in the hands of one person. Now, if you look at Hungary, modern Hungary under Viktor Orban, he did something very similar with the idea quite explicitly of destroying democracy and creating what he called illiberal democracy or Christian democracy, a world in which a few usually white heteronormative men controlled the lives of women, racial and ethnic minorities, and gender minorities in order to return what they considered a traditional worldview to their country. Now, this has really never happened in the United States before. And one of the things that I think is important when you think about Project 2025 is to think of it in tandem with the July 1st, 2024 Supreme Court decision in Donald J. Trump versus United States, in which today's radical Supreme Court overturned the very rule of law in the United States of America to say that one man is above the rule of law, and that's the President of the United States, who it said cannot be indicted or prosecuted for crimes committed as part of his official duties. Now, we've never had this in the United States before, but we have had something really similar that may surprise people. And that's that if you think about what happened in the American South from about 1874 to about 1965, we had a one-party region that essentially had overturned democracy and was ruled by a very small group of people. And in that American South, essentially, the states and the state legislatures decided how people would live within those states. They passed their laws that discriminated against people of color, Black Americans, and certainly discriminated against women. And at the same time, the way that that played out on the ground was that capital fled the region because there was no point in trying to invest in a factory, for example, in the American South, if who you knew was how would determine how well that factory would do. And similarly, even white Americans who theoretically would be privileged by this system, their lives too depended on who they knew. And so while we haven't seen the attempt at a national level to concentrate power in one single person in the United States, we have seen how the idea of a one-party system plays out. And it played out in the American South in a way that really destroyed the economy and destroyed equality.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Once a country does fall victim to some type of an autocratic leader, and I know we've spoken about the example of Hungary, and we're still looking at this right now. Can you talk about the likelihood of coming back from that?
Well, that's sort of a large philosophical question, right? Because you don't just have to look at Hungary, you also have to look at places like Russia, which is, again, a model for some people on the radical right nowadays. And look what's happening to Russian citizens right now who are being shoveled into the maw of a military that's grinding them up and leaving them to die on the battlefields. The larger philosophical question, though, is will humans, especially Americans in this case, accept the loss of their right to determine their own futures? And Lots of people argue about this, and I'm hedging a little bit because there's a saying among American historians that Americans will never put up with autocracy because we're too darn ornery. We've never tested it before. What will happen if you game out the idea of putting a Trump-Vance ticket back into the White House, it seems, is pretty dramatic repression of those who object to the overturning of democracy, and the attempt to guarantee, as Trump has said, that we will never have to vote again. Will Americans put up with that? My inclination is no. But what that would do is it would usher in a very long period, I think, of extraordinary domestic unrest, violence, and probably not in our lifetimes, mine anyway, the return of democracy.
I know you've spoken extensively about the prospect of Trump coming back into the White House. I'm curious, in your opinion, what part of Donald Trump's agenda, plans, from a historical perspective, worries you the most?
Well, Trump's a really interesting character because while we've been talking about Project 2025, I don't think he has any real ideological positions at all, except that he wants Donald J. Trump to stay out of jail and he wants Donald J. Trump to have power and money.
Right.
And so, in a way, the fact that a leader who has no convictions at all is a huge problem. I would also look at J.D. Vance, who is very much working for the billionaires like Peter Thiel, and who there has suddenly been a real move on the part of the Trump-Vance team to talk a lot about major cryptocurrency initiatives and the intersection of the interests of billionaires right now in cryptocurrency, which to me looks very much like I call it, without intending it to be derogatory, the Wild West of a new technology. That those new technologies or the new fields for investment are always, when we first get into them, unregulated, and they are always controlled by a very few extraordinarily wealthy people. And they always, and I'm talking about mining, I'm talking about cotton, I'm talking about copper, I'm talking about diamonds, I'm talking about oil, I'm talking about all these things. They always hurt the majority of the people. Now, when I look at this ticket, I look at Trump and the fact he's 78 years old and is not seemingly in good health. And then I look at the fact that J.D. Vance seems very much to be pushing the idea of these tech bros, as they say, that they're the ones who should control the world. And that's actually what worries me the most, because if you concentrate power in one executive, and you then put that one executive in the control of billionaires who are interested in controlling the world's money supply, I feel a little bit like that looks like a James Bond movie, except we're actually living in it.
That is an amazing point that I haven't heard before at all. I mean, I've heard inklings of people say that, Peter Thiel had worked to install J.D. Vance for the fact that he wants influence there, of course, but not to the extent that how it basically works with all of the other aspects of consolidating power in the executive branch. That would eventually make J.D. Vance, make Peter Thiel by association, extraordinarily powerful in this country. There are those on the right who say that Democrats are just being hysterical by saying that Donald Trump is going to be some type of an autocrat and that we already had 4 years of him before and that we all survived. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, everybody has made it very clear that those who held the guardrails in the Trump administration, to the extent they did, are gone now. He's been very clear about that. And one of the goals of Project 2025 was to say, we're not going to be stopped again the way we were in the first term. Right. But I think there's a larger point that you're making here that you and I probably, I won't speak for you, but you and I probably have both run into. And that's that what the Trump people are talking about is indeed so extreme that it's hard to convince people that it's real. You feel like when and it's one of the reasons I always cite my sources is because you feel like when you're saying they want to end all abortion, they want to take away birth control, they want to have a national abortion ban. You hear those things and you think, oh, no, that couldn't possibly be the case. Or, they are trying to take over the military. And you think about our military, which has this long and storied history, and you think, oh, come on, we've never done that before. But they are saying it. They are putting in place policy papers to do that. They are filling positions. They have this whole list of people to fill positions and do those things. And I think if we don't take it seriously, we're making a huge mistake.
Well, that's why I thought it was so important to speak to you today, because of that exact reason. I mean, we're out here saying that they're going to do X, Y, Z, and we're saying it because they are promising it. But at the same time, it's hard for us to imagine it as Americans because we just don't have a schema for that in this country. But I think when we do take a moment to look at historical precedent, and when I say historical, we don't even have to look far, because to your exact points earlier in this conversation, you discussed Hungary and Russia, and these are happening right now, and we're watching these countries turn into illiberal states. And I think that it is important to look elsewhere, that we're not special, and it's happened in other countries, and it can happen right here, and it's already happened to a degree. When you look at Chevron, when you look at Dobbs, when you look at historic precedents that have been completely turned on their head in this country that we didn't think could ever happen, and yet for the first time we are seeing rollbacks in rights that kind of defy anything that we've seen in American history before.
Yes, and there's another really important angle to this, I think, and that is the rhetorical structure that Trump has always used is one that was, in fact, embraced by the Nazis in Germany. And that was the idea of what was called the big lie. But it had a concept. And the concept behind it was that if you, and I used to say to my students, if your roommate steals $20, you're mad at your roommate because you can conceive of that kind of a crime. But if your roommate breaks into your entire family's bank accounts, sells their house, wipes out everybody's retirement, takes everything, runs up the credit cards, and so on, you don't really have a language or an emotional groundwork to get mad at that person because it is so beyond anything you can imagine. You don't have the tools to do that. And that was really quite literally the goal in many ways of the way that the Nazis approached what they were doing, is to say something that was so outrageous that people would dismiss it. And they were quite articulate about this being the plan. And this is one of the things that Trump has done when he continually comes out and says, yeah, I did that, or yeah, I did that, or yeah, I'm going to do this. People think, well, I must be misunderstanding it, because of course you wouldn't want to take over American democracy and replace it with a dictator. Of course, the Supreme Court wouldn't take away a constitutional right that has been recognized for almost 50 years. Of course, the Supreme Court wouldn't give the president the right to commit crimes in office. And yet, all of those things have actually happened, and we need to be aware of them and to create the mental apparatus to say, yeah, these are really bad guys. But crucially, they can be stopped before they take office and are able to complete those plans. And that's the place that we need to be engaged for the next, 80 some odd days.
Right. So in trying to figure out how to effectively convey this warning to people, I'm curious if I can get your 1-minute pitch to someone in the social media era who is scrolling on TikTok, for example, in terms of adequately conveying the danger of what a Trump presidency would bring.
The Trump presidency will bring a dictatorship. But on social media, what I would suggest is to lean into not the hatred and the anger and the backward looking of the Trump-Vance campaign, but to emphasize that democracy is about us creating a community. And that's actually a joyful enterprise. That's one of the reasons I think that the Harris-Walz campaign has taken off the way it has, is that this should be a joyful enterprise. And that, I think, is what people really will lean into going forward and need to, as we create a nation that can address the issues of the 21st century.
And I think that's such an accurate point, too, because it's been, I know I speak for a lot of people who are watching this right now and thinking this is the first time that we've felt not just that we're trying to, stave off some impending demise, but that we actually feel hope in terms of what we could do, in terms of codifying abortion rights, in terms of protecting the planet from climate change, in terms of protecting young people from the proliferation of guns and weapons of war, in terms of making healthcare more affordable so more people are covered and can live long, healthy lives, in terms of making sure that workers have more workers' rights so that they can live with dignity. And just there is it doesn't always have to be so miserable. There can be can be so much hope in the prospect of what can happen in this country. And we saw a lot of that, by the way, with the Biden-Harris administration, stuff that we never thought would be possible. And yet right now we have the strongest economic recovery in the world. We have the government finally negotiating drug prices. We have our infrastructure being revamped. We have manufacturing coming back and booming in this country to the tune of 800,000 jobs, which is to say nothing of the 16 million total jobs that we've added. So there is a lot of hope that a Harris-Walz campaign presidency, White House could actually bring, building on the success that we've seen today.
Yeah, I would say that, but let me add something else with my backward look at U.S. history. There's also music and art and philosophy and new ways to approach education and new combinations. And when I think about the joy and the creation of a new America, I think of the things you're talking about for sure, but I also think about things like Snoop Dogg and Martha Stewart at the Olympics. And the fact that, as I understand it, Snoop Dogg asked Martha Stewart to join him with the dressage because he's afraid of horses. I'm afraid of horses. And you look at that and you just think, that's what America should be, is these two people from, very different creative pursuits being able to call on each other and say, okay, I'm really not okay around horses and I'm trying to be, but could you hold my hand a little bit? Yeah. And that, I think, is the kind of vibe that has always made America be America in a way that other countries can't, that we have these different voices and we have these different approaches to the world. And together they are far greater than the sum of their parts. And that is, when I think about the joy of this moment, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about: the gardens and the paintings and the friendships and the communities, as well as the political policies that reflect those things.
Right, as opposed to just retreating into tribalism, because that's what our politics wants us to do right now. Heather, what's it like for you as a historian to witness history repeat itself so easily, so predictably, and yet the warnings of the past feel like they don't register at all with so much of the population?
Well, partly, I think they have not registered, in part because we thought that they were the guardrails that we'd put in place after World War II were always going to be there. We were always going to have civil rights. We were always going to have Social Security. We were always going to have a focus on public health. Those things that many of us grew up with, we thought would always be there. So that's partly, I think, why it feels a little bit like we want to shake people and say you really could lose these things. But what has really jumped out to me is, because of my age, I have spent my entire professional career fighting a holding action, trying to defend American democracy, first from a rising oligarchy and now from a dictatorship. And for years, I have been telling people that I had faith in the American people and that American society would turn on a dime. But I kept waiting for it to turn on that dime, and I kept trying to find places where it might happen. And if I look at what has happened in this country since July 21st, when President Joe Biden said he would not accept the Democratic nomination for president, what I have seen is the country turning on a dime. And I don't really know. It's like sitting in the middle of a whirlwind and being part of it and watching it and trying to analyze it at the same time I'm part of it is actually calling out a lot of muscles that I don't really have, because I've never been in this place before, like the country hasn't been in this place before.
What gives you hope right now?
Oh, the American people. Really, the American people. It always has. I mean, when push came to shove, always in the past, Americans have stepped up to the plate to defend democracy. What worried me in this moment was really since 1980, with our increasing emphasis on great leaders, which is really itself a form of reinforcement of the idea of oligarchy or dictatorship, people seem to lose their understanding that they could affect the future. And one of the things that I have always done in the webcasts and stuff I do is to remind people that democracy is about us, not about our leaders. They work for us. And it feels like that concept has finally gotten traction. And if it does, what we will see is a world that more accurately reflects the majority of the American people. So we do protect civil rights. We do protect the environment. We do have common sense gun safety legislation. All the things that are popular with more than 79 to 80% of the American people. And that is a reinforcement of democracy. It's a reinforcement of agency, and it's a reinforcement of the idea that at the end of the day, the Declaration of Independence was right, and human beings have a right to determine their own futures. And that is both our most conservative possible position and our most progressive future.
Well, that right there is exactly why so many people tune in to hear what you have to say. To that point, then, your newsletter is called Letters from an American. It's read by 1.5 million people. What do you cover, and where can they sign up to hear more from you?
So I am a historian. I'm not a journalist. So what I do is what all historians do, I look for what creates change in society. So when I write Letters from an American, I'm trying to take a snapshot of America on every single day. My cutoff is midnight on Eastern time, and take a look at anything that happened that day that looks as if it is part of a longer story in American history that is currently changing. And that is available for free on Facebook and on Substack, just under heathercoxrichardson.substack.com. It is not partisan, really. It is a historical look at where we have been and where we are, and to some degree where it seems that we are going, although I don't prognosticate at all. I tell you what happened, not necessarily what I think about what happened.
And of course, we'll put the link to your newsletter in the post description and the show notes of this episode. Highly recommend for those watching and listening right now to sign up. And finally, your best-selling book, Democracy Awakening, is coming out in paperback in October. Heather, why did you write this book?
Well, originally I wrote the book to answer the questions that people ask me all the time. How did the parties switch sides? What is liberalism? What's the difference between a democracy and a republic? But pretty quickly it became clear that the question that people asked me most is, how did we get here? What on earth is going on? And how do we get out? And so the book is divided into those three parts. And the third part of it, I think, is actually in many ways, to me, the most interesting, because it's a how-to manual for expanding democracy by taking a look at all the different ways in our history that people have taken these concepts that were articulated in the Declaration of Independence and then turned them into the modern democracy we have today. But that being said, I understand that there is a new book coming out on the other side of this interview as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that my book is called Shameless, and you were kind enough to sit with me and give me some guidance in terms of the historical aspects of what we're seeing right now in today's modern Republican Party. And so I do focus on a lot of the plans that Republicans laid out in the beginning, whether it's from the Powell memo, whether it's from Roger Ailes' memo that would eventually come to be what Fox News is today, Project Red Map, which in 2010 was the plan in the aftermath of Obama's election to start gerrymandering the states. So how Republicans have used these long-standing plans, which are bearing fruit right now in a big way. We've spoken in this conversation about how the Supreme Court, how the Supreme Court and much of the judiciary has been there to help the Republican Party consolidate power. These are plans that have been laid out for a long time. So that's coming out in just a few days. It's available for pre-order right now as well. And again, thank you for your help. The book wouldn't be what it is without your input. So for those who are watching, a big aspect of pre-orders, which is this period that we're in right now, is to make sure that the publishers know how many copies to actually print. So if there aren't a lot of pre-orders, then the publisher will see, okay, that we're not going to put aside, enough paper basically to make sure that we can print it when it's actually out. So for those watching, if you do think that you might want to buy it at some point, this is actually the best time to do so, because it makes sure that we have enough copies to actually last for the duration of the run. So for those watching, if you want to support my work and if you want to support Heather's work, both of our books, Shameless and Democracy Awakening, are available to go grab whenever you have a chance. Heather, It is a pleasure to be able to talk to you, and I think this interview is a testament to why so many people have signed up for your newsletter and have bought your book thus far to hear what you have to say. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, back at you. I love this show. Glad to be here.